Welcome back to Advertising is Dead with Guru. Guru, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Varun and team, for having me. It's a great pleasure. And let me start off by hoping that all of you and your families are doing well and are staying safe and healthy during these times.
Thanks, Guru. I also find it interesting that this is how we start our calls, and I feel that this is something we'll continue. Whenever that, I hate to use the term post-COVID, but in my head, I'm like, I think that's if I have to list down things which I feel we've added on to which we should continue. This will be one of those. We've never actually done that, right? As human beings. We just say hi and move on to work. But this for me has been one of the most interesting pieces of COVID. Not taking away from the larger implications, etc. To kind of start off our conversation, right, I want to really, I was running through some of the talks that you've given in the past and some of the conversations you've had. And I found your perspective on explaining the entire digital money ecosystem and how that kind of has built out to be very interesting, just from a broad-based standpoint. So I'd like to start off with that, just your perspective on that market and how there are elements of it sometimes we don't really realize, and there's so much more to it.
Sure, Varun. And, I share your distaste for the word COVID these days because we seem to be using it so much. So I've started to refer to the time before March 2020 and after March 2020 as the before times and the after times. So I'm waiting for the after times, but the memory of what it used to be like in the before times is also receding, I would say, as time goes on. One wonders what normalcy looked like and if it was just a figment of our imagination, the way we have stayed in this state for this long. No, that's a very good question, Varun, and a great point to start our conversation. I think very germane to us as a company at PayPal, because this is the business that we are in. And for me, I've worked at PayPal for about 5.5 years now, and an element which is so fundamental to the human experience, money, you tend to, like most other elements of the human experience that are very fundamental, you tend to just take it for granted. You tend to assume that the way it is the way it has always been and the way it will always be. And if there is one thing that we have noticed in the last 1 year, as well as throughout our own existence, if we pay a little deeper attention to it, is that change is one aspect of the human condition that nobody can control, nobody can change that aspect, and you just have to accept that aspect. And money has gone through its share of changes as well. So if you look at how human beings have evolved from the time of when we were hunter-gatherers to when we started to build societal structures, started to perceive value in day-to-day activities and a way to exchange that value. Initially, it started off with just providing goods and services in exchange for other goods and services. It was straight off, very easy to perceive the barter system. And there were fundamental issues related to this, right? You couldn't store that value. It had to be very much in the moment. The transaction would make sense only in that moment. You couldn't store that value. You couldn't exchange certain things for other things if you couldn't assess the relative values of those. And all of those problems become a lot more challenging if you're using the barter system, because you don't quite know if me taking the help of a UI designer to design some beautiful poster for me is the same as me going and doing dishes in his house for, should it be one day or should it be 1 week, or, what should it be? So it's super challenging. So sometime in the middle, and this is the biggest thing, area of angst for me, is while we have inventors and discoverers that we can put names to, that individual or set of individuals who came up with this concept of disintermediating value through the use of currency, some object to denote that decoupling, that person deserves the equivalent of a Nobel Prize, because it was an aspect that has changed humanity fundamentally, right? And so once that came about, it was a brilliant invention. Now you have something that you can use as a medium to exchange value, and currency in various forms, whether it's coin, gold, bank notes, etc. They've just been here for several thousand years now. to a point where I think in all the way maybe until about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we just kind of assumed that this is the way money is always going to be. And then comes, along PayPal about 20 years ago, and then a few more digital payments companies here and there slowly. And then the last 2 or 3 years, you notice that around the world, digital payments, fintech in general is the hottest thing literally since sliced bread. And there's a reason for it, because as life has changed, our lives have become increasingly digital. We find that many of the most fundamental experiences that we've gotten used to are now undergoing phenomenal transformation. It could be in the way we consume media, it could be in the way we connect and interact with people. And why would money remain immune to this change? It is, after all, a product of the world that we live in. And so that's where, the thinking has been that money is one area which hasn't been disrupted for a long time. And here we are in a beautiful confluence of technology and attitude coming together in a world that increasingly has gone digital. So payments going digital, money going digital, financial services being transformed is not just inevitable because the world is going that way, but it's incredibly necessary, because inequities that have built up in societies across the world have a lot to do with people's ability to participate in financial services. It's I think fairly intuitive when you look at it. People who have greater means to participate in financial systems have better lives. And this is borne out not just by research, but by things you can perceive in the world around you. And if you're able to democratize access to financial services to an extent where everybody can have this opportunity, then it stands to reason that the world will be a better place. And for us at PayPal, our mission is to democratize financial services so that the world becomes a better place. And in this mission, digitization and technology are not just pillars, they are just so core and central that is the only way we see forward in making this change happen. I hope that gives you, it's a long-winded answer, but I hope it gives you all the way going back to the Stone Ages to where we land up in, where we have landed up in today.
No, I love the fact that you started off with the Stone Age, right? Because in many cases, when you look at the barter system and you see the entire conversation happening around, crypto and everything else, and in some ways, you're kind of coming back to that in a different form altogether. But when I kind of go back to how in PayPal started it, and I keep looking at obviously there is I forget the exact term, but it's basically like if you look at the founders of PayPal and then all the companies that came out of those founders over time, it's literally our entire tech stack of what we use across the world has kind of in some way come from a PayPal connection. And I found that intriguing. I found this interesting graphic the other day, which I was running through. But also from a digital payment standpoint, I'm just taking off from one of the things you said. It's the kind of unified how we look at transactions, because you'd have different currencies, you'd have different things, but just from the fact that for someone to be able to go to a bank and have that transaction, I'm going back to, and it'll make me seem old, like talking about like passbooks and all those things that you had. In some way, this makes it so much more accessible across categories, and almost bring everybody to the same level of being able to function. And I think especially over the last year, it's really been that one, like I was talking to someone the other day and said, imagine if we didn't have the ability to do online payments over the last year. And it just like fundamentally makes you think about how you would have even done the basic necessities over there. So when you are looking at a sector like this and how it kind of grows, how does this kind of evolve then? If you look at the entire digital currency model or like the whole fintech model, how does that evolve? What are you seeing as spaces from a macro perspective that are trends in the space?
No, it's a very good question, and it brings back so many memories, Varun, when you say passbook, right? I suspect that your audience is made up of people who don't even know what that word means.
Yeah.
So they're probably scratching their head saying, "What the hell is a passbook?"
Google Passbook is what I would say.
It is, and it's incredible. Just when I moved back to India from the US after having lived there for a little over a decade. I remember the challenges I had in trying to open a bank account in some of our more traditional banks, I would say, right? You have to get 3 other high net worth individuals who have bank accounts there in good standing, who will give you an introduction letter, and then you have to actually get their signatures. That used to be the world that we lived in, and just think about it, the barriers are so high to getting people into it. I mean, I have the privileges of being, having grown up in a middle class upbringing and knowing people, and maybe it's relatively easy for me to go find 3 people. But if that's the kind of bar you're putting for people to even join the banking system, which is such an essential human need, then you can imagine how left out so many people are. And look at where we are today, where for you, it takes in a minute, you can download an app and you can sign up and you can be underway transacting today on many of these systems, right? And that's the beauty of it. End of the day, the evolution, I would say, for not just for PayPal, but for any company that seeks to do good in this domain, the starting point has to be the customer. Like, what does the customer's life look like, and what does that customer's journey look like, and how are we going to find ways to bring in technology into the picture to be able to augment that person's life in ways that would truly add value to them, save them time, give them greater ability to get the things that they want, buy the things they need, etc., without having to jump through hoops along the way, right? So if I look at what aspects are truly evolving during this time, one is identity. It has become such a core part of what we do in the world around us. Being able to establish our identity, being able to protect it, being able to accumulate different aspects onto our profile of our identity, personalization, loyalty, all of these aspects stem from understanding what your identity is. And that's why it's such a holy grail for a lot of companies, because you need to be able to authenticate and authorize a person, but then you need to be able to treat them as though you have a digital twin of yourself that is going through the entire journey. And that digital twin is being treated with utmost care, compassion, understanding, empathy, etc., so that the physical manifestation of that digital twin really gets a wonderful experience. So the whole idea is for all of us companies who are born digital, like PayPal, this is probably the hardest problem to solve, right? Because there is you're enamored by technology, you're enamored by the ability to scale and the ability to bring all this fantastic AI and ML in place. But I think the core part that you have to remember is, why are we doing this? We are doing it in service of the customer. We want to make their life better, and technology is useful only when it makes their life better, not just because it's cool. We need to use it not just because it's cool, but because we are able to make the life of a customer cool, right? So that's the thing. So I think the trust is another one, which is huge. Being able to insert trust into an equation, that in a world where you're not relying on physical contact anymore. Earlier on, you would just walk around to the corner store. You've probably known that person. If you've lived in that neighborhood, your parents have known that person, your grandparents have known that person's grandparents. I mean, you know how it goes, right? The physical connection is very huge, especially when you relate it to more Asian cultures. A huge part of your trust is born out of participation within the community. And now you expand it into a world where you are completely transacting with strangers across borders in different parts of the world. And you realize that the only way somebody can trust such a system is if there is an intermediary like a PayPal that can insert trust into the system. So this is one of my favorite lines, and it's something that I repeat often. So if those of you have heard it, I apologize, but it's very true. PayPal is not in the payments business. We are in the trust business. Our job is to bring in so much trust into the ecosystem that buyers and sellers worldwide can interact with each other without having to worry about whether they are going to end up in a bad situation with encountering a nefarious seller or a nefarious buyer. And that's part of our business. And these are all elements that are continuing to rapidly emerge and rapidly evolve as technology changes, because with every new generation of technology that comes in, our ability to identify, to establish identity, our ability to establish identity in very ambient ways without them having to actually type in a password or things like that, our ability to generate trust by figuring out a variety of different factors that go into seeing if you really are the person who you say you are and that you're authorized to do the thing that you're trying to do. All of this goes up so that all of these friction points can recede into the background, and your core focus can be in getting what you want, buying what you need, buying what you desire, without making the payment experience very friction filled and the credit experience very friction filled. Instead, all of this is recedes into the background thanks to the magic of technology.
You know, I was just going by the Kirana store example you're giving, right? And most times when you look at and if I go back to like how PayPal has functioned over the years and how it's kind of like every transaction which I've had where a business has used PayPal to kind of do that, how have you kind of had to evolve for the Indian market? Because the Indian markets, anybody I speak to, I think this is not even like a category thing. I think every single category I speak to speaks about India like we're a very different animal across anything that is there. How has India been different, and how has your model kind of evolved for India? And there are two parts to this. One part is on one end, how do you look at it from the customers you work with, and on the other end, how do you then look at it from the kind of people you actually have in the organization? So I think that there are two parts to that.
Yeah, no, it's again a really good question and very nuanced, right? Like, so if you look at a few different elements that go into any market that you go into, and India being one example and a really good example, there is entrenched user behavior that you first need to understand, because if people within the system are used to a certain thing, then they're used to it for a good reason, either because the system imposes certain constraints that gets them to behave in that way, or because something about the system is working so well that they don't feel a need to really change unless there's tremendous value being added.
Yeah.
So for us, when we look at the Indian payment landscape, right, I think the question was one about where can we truly add value, because there are lots of good players in the Indian ecosystem right now. Many of them are our competitors, and several of them are our partners as well, and they're adding tremendous value within the ecosystem. And if you look at how the landscape has changed over the last few years, the Indian customer is a very coveted beast, if you will. Right. So the Indian customer is typically pretty fickle in their attention span when it comes to being loyal to brands. They are quite price conscious and value conscious. They're very, very conscious about what constitutes a good price for the value they're getting. Maybe more so than many other markets in the world. And when you factor in a perfect storm of venture capital money being poured into the Indian ecosystem, you've got the conditions for a few interesting things to happen, right? So over the last few years, there's been increasingly a tendency for the Indian customer to be habituated to cashbacks and incentives as a way to assess whether something is worth doing or not.
Yeah.
So the several times I noticed many of the millennials within my organization in particular, finding no barrier at all to uninstalling and reinstalling apps and getting new IDs and transacting again and again to get these cashbacks, coupons, incentives, etc. So that was one that it was interesting, because a very different pattern from anything else that we see in other markets that we serve around the world. But more, closer to our own mission and vision, right? If you look at our intent to truly be a force for good and uplift people through access to financial services, then India is a very, very good market, because that is where a need really, really exists. Especially if you look at the Indian economy, such a significant portion of the Indian economy is actually micro and small enterprises, right? The MSME sector. These are the small little cooperative entities that are building, handicrafts and, creating beautiful works of art, or they are little shops that are trying to do ed tech. There may be individuals who are freelancing and doing something on the side, a variety of different things, and they number in the millions. And what they truly lack are the tools to get their business up and running and make it sustainable, and two, an audience, because a business can stand and flourish only if there is an audience to consume the services or the goods that it is producing. And for us, we thought that that was a great opportunity for us to really come in and add value. And that's one of the cornerstones of our business in India. We essentially run a cross-border business that aims to fulfill the need for an audience as well as for a global audience to be able to really get the best of India. So there are buyers from outside who really want to buy from India, and the MSME sector is underrepresented in terms of having an audience, and we are there to bridge that gap. And secondly, there are Indian buyers who want to acquire the best and brightest of what's out there in the world. And for them, PayPal is a safe option to be able to go into a website and trust that their financial information is going to be safe no matter where they are transacting. So we are there to insert trust in this cross-border business, and I think it also is in alignment with our mission and vision, which is where we are focusing our efforts right now in India.
Before I get into the people aspect, which I was wanted to get into as well, there's one point which you said which is interesting, right? When we look at one thing which digital has done is that it's let us kind of it's kind of taken borders away from the way we are online. Mm-hmm. So this factor of trust when you are transacting between countries requires an almost global outlook of saying, okay, when I use PayPal here, they use PayPal there, work with PayPal on both ends. So I'm not trying to learn something new, and that's actually interesting aspect, because the more I look at the sector you've spoken of, a lot of them see a lot of growth when they transact with customers outside of India, because obviously, I mean, it's not just the currency exchange, but also I think in general it makes it so interesting because the accessibility to do that now is so much, it's so far ahead than where it was before. Like I remember a time, because my mother used to run one of those, and I know that for her to ship stuff, have to find a courier. It was very base level, and I tell her sometimes that this could have literally been the business that she could have kind of scaled up to, and almost have like a global D2C approach to that, because I think a lot of her customers were in the US because she was in the textile business. And when you look at that whole trust factor, how do you kind of make sure that you balance two things, right? One is that you still have to have local nuance to the product, but on the other end, you also need to have a global, I'm using similarity for lack of a better word here, but how do you kind of balance that out?
No, your example is spot on, because there was a time when, of course, India is full of talent when it comes to designing stuff. And, let's say Indian garments, saris in particular, earlier, the cross-border business would work like this. You knew somebody who was in the US, your relative, maybe your daughter, your son, your daughter-in-law, whoever, and you would ship a bunch of stuff to them, and they would basically through word of mouth sell a bunch of stuff, and then you'd get your money back. That was cross-border business. The audience gathering was so personal, and it was by its very approach very limiting, right? You can only get as far as your audience gathering capabilities are with your personal circle. And now you've got a means where you can just put on a website, throw on a pay with PayPal there, and the next thing you know, you have 370 million customers around the world who can actually buy from you. And that is incredible. I mean, you've gone from a handful of neighbors and friends and relatives to actually having 370 million people. So the world has come a long way. And if you look at a company like PayPal, we are global in nature, but we need to necessarily be local in our products because of a couple of things. One, customer preference, which is obviously the most important. We need to be able to meet the customer in the location they are in, catering to the needs that they have. The second important constituent, in addition to the customer, is compliance and regulation, because each of these different areas that we operate in, 203 markets around the world and counting, each of them has, each jurisdiction has their own set of rules and regulations and compliance and data protection, and you name it, anything to do with finance tends to be a very heavily regulated field for the right reasons. And for PayPal, the challenge is twofold. One, it's in the customer experience. And the second, is in the regulatory environment. Both of them need to be catered to extremely specifically for a certain region. But then if you had to build 203 different versions of PayPal and then maintain their individual life cycles and then figure out the strategic roadmap for each of them, we would soon be 203 different companies. I mean, it's impossible to operate like that, right? Yeah. So the way we solve that is to assess through our discovery process, what are the core set of capabilities that we need to build across all of these markets? What does the common platform look like? So we have a bunch of common platforms that all of these products are built on top of, and that is common across the world, right? So the platform remains uniform and it's completely one for the entire company. And then on top of that, you enable enough configurability so that in every new market that you go to, you can tweak the compliance needs as well as the experience needs to be able to cater to that particular market. Of course, I'm probably oversimplifying it because there will be a lot of custom development also needed in some cases, but it's, for us, that's the only way we can actually sustain a global business. If we take a very platform oriented approach, make everything microservices based, API driven, so that any new customization on top of that can be very quickly composed and built and deployed in local conditions, depending on what they are. But for especially when it comes to India, right? What's in the news today? It's all about UPI, the billions, if not trillions of transactions that are possible on UPI. Yeah. And UPI is founded on a single concept of having a unique identity for you, which is very simple and easy to remember and is connected to your bank account, but you don't need to remember an IFSC code and you don't need the bank account number. You don't need anything other than an email-like handle. Yeah. I go back 20 years ago. That is exactly the principle on which PayPal was founded, that your email address should be enough for anybody to send you money. Yeah. We don't need to know anything more about you. Just an email address is enough, right? And that's exactly what UPI is also doing. So it's a great validation that an entire country of 1.4 billion people can actually not just use, but be delighted by the UPI experience. And full credit to the Indian regulators, the financial system, and the government for having pushed this so actively, because it was the need of the hour. It was a system that was built just to satisfy the need that arose. And for us at PayPal, we take great pride and satisfaction in seeing that UPI is such a twin of the approach that we use to launch PayPal, and that's exactly what's working in India as well.
So when you look at the people you bring onto the team, right? Because you obviously require people who are understanding the fact that you are building for the globe, but you also are focusing on the local market, and there's so many other elements to it. Run me by a little bit about the kind of work that you do in India, and also the kind of people you kind of hire and bring in, and how does the operation kind of look at? Because I've always found it intriguing to look at global companies and their local operations, because in many ways the local operations aren't local. They are global in the context of what they do, but they're also innately local in just the culture of things. So I'd love to kind of get into what you actually you do in India, but also how that connects to everything that you do as PayPal globally.
Sure. So we are a global company. We have 3 centers in India: Bangalore, Chennai, and Hyderabad, and we are pushing up almost into the zone of 6,000 employees and counting, and we are hiring big time now. Most of you must have seen many articles that talks about us hiring well over 1,000 people this year. We hired over 1,000 people last year as well during the pandemic. And I think there are a few things that are common, right? The hiring bar that we use to assess who is worthy of joining PayPal, that is common across the world. It doesn't matter whether you're somebody being hired in India, you're being hired in the US or Germany or Australia or wherever, the bar is uniform. So that if you're worthy of being employed by PayPal, you're worthy of being employed by PayPal anywhere in the world. And it's not just the competence that we are looking at in terms of hard skills or the abilities in terms of soft skills. but also the attitude and the sense of purpose and the kind of fire in the belly, if you will, that people bring to the table. Because we want not just to be a company that makes money for our shareholders. That's not the primary objective. The primary objective is to serve the world and make it a better place. And our niche is in financial services. And we want to be able to disrupt that area for the good and truly bring about change that the world can seek value in, right? And we are looking for individuals who would be powerfully motivated by a sense of purpose above everything else. So those are the common aspects to how we do hiring across the world. If you look at the US, where we are headquartered, or a significant presence in China, we also have a huge presence in India. What is unique to India is that we are a microcosm of all parts of PayPal. So practically every function that makes PayPal run, whether it is product, engineering, finance, IT, the procurement teams and the facilities teams, every as a function of that has a global presence in PayPal has a presence in India, and that is unique. There is no other single location for PayPal, including our own headquarters, where this is true. We have even customer support, for example, that is run out of the India centers. So we are truly a complete representation of PayPal in one location, right? So that's very unique to PayPal in India. And so what we do here is we have a variety of different things. The way PayPal is built, we have a set of foundational platforms that power a variety of common aspects for all of PayPal, including developer tools, productivity tools, our public cloud, private cloud infrastructure, our security, all of these aspects that are common and foundational to the way the company runs in terms of the tech stack. That's part of the foundational platforms. On top of that, we have a bunch of common platforms which power all the experiences on top. Platforms like identity, risk, customer service, etc. All these platforms are underneath. And then on top of that, we have branded and unbranded experiences that the customers actually touch and feel. So these are the place where the PayPal brand shows up and payments actually happen. So across all of these teams, and I've given you like literally a 30-40 second overview of how PayPal is structured internally, right? All these teams are present in India. Every single team that I talked about, foundational platforms, common platforms, branded experiences, unbranded experiences, the tech team for PayPal, all of these are present in India. In addition to this, the IT team that powers employee experiences across the world, as well as core platforms for HR, for finance, etc., that run the company, also those teams are in India. Customer support, where we actually talk to customers and help them solve their problems, those teams are also in India. So, I can go on and on, but all of these are in India, and we are hiring across the board in all of these areas. What is exciting for me is that the way our India organization is structured is heavy on accountability and ownership. So we have a concept of an N in a box team, where the N is the number of people it takes to actually build a product end to end. Typically, it would involve engineering, it would involve product management, it would involve designing the UI or the APIs of the product. It would involve program management to lend a degree of structure. And then it would also involve product analytics to be able to measure what you're building and making sure that it's actually measuring up to what you had originally intended. So this practically every team that we have in India, barring a few exceptions for the right reasons, the teams in India are already built in the structure where the single shoulder to tap, using a politically correct term, because single neck to choke seems to be quite a bad term in today's context. But the single shoulder to tap when you want an answer to any question is for that particular area will be in India. So there's tremendous ownership and accountability, and we have seen that this makes for better careers. It makes for happier employees. It makes for people who are more invested and have more skin in the game, and who have more decision-making authority that gives people the satisfaction of going home and sleeping in the night, or staying home and sleeping in the night, as the case is today with the work from home situation. Yeah. The satisfaction of actually having done something concrete for the customers, thanks to the decisions that you yourself took right? And that's priceless. And that, I think, is a huge part of PayPal's culture and why we have industry leading metrics when it comes to, and measures when it comes to how few people we attrit from our system every year. And that's something that all of us at PayPal are inordinately proud of, that attrition levels are very low in the India centers and engagement levels are very high in the India centers.
You make an interesting point, right? And I always wondered this, because when you are a global company, most times, and I love the model for ownership, because in many cases you feel like you're a cog in the wheel, but you're not really being able to take the calls you want to take because you know what's really need for that market. And I think this is an interesting way to kind of build that in, and also once you have ownership, then you obviously, it then seeps into every part of your work culture. And how does that kind of look? Because what I find it also, I have this sighting where I really look at how companies focus on people and culture, because I think that's a incredible area to focus on. We spend so much time in our lives at work, that how that culturally shapes us as human beings is something which I sometimes find intriguing to kind of dig into. So when you look at this, on one end, on the work front, it's about the ownership. How does that kind of seep back and onto the culture side of things?
A beautiful question, and it's something that truly I can't help smiling when I talk about these topics, because there is so much goodness that comes out of trust in the organization. End of the day, when you look at why companies go from good to being great, and I would argue that no company is great all the time. You have to constantly keep staying great, achieving more greatness, etc. Right? It's a journey.
Yeah.
And the companies that accomplish this and have happy employees who are fully invested in this are the ones where there is an abundance of trust every which way, every direction, between people and their peers, between people and their bosses, between people and stakeholders that depend on them or that they depend on, etc., etc. There's ample trust, right? And I think the goal of culture building is this: it is to instill trust in the system. And for us, for me, it was an epiphany I had when one day I was driving in Bangalore, and this was in the before times, before the pandemic.
Before times, yeah.
In the before
I'm
times,
gonna steal that one from you.
Yeah, well, full credit where it's due. I actually stole it from another podcast. I'm a listener of this podcast called Marketplace. There's a great host called Kai Risdal, and he uses this term in his podcast. So I'm stealing it from him. So the traffic was intense in Bangalore, as those of you who've ever been to Bangalore know. And I was stuck one day, and the mind wanders. And one of the things I've realized is your most creative moments are not when you're giving something absolute focus. When it's an absence of focus that actually sparks creativity somehow. And when your mind is wandering and you're thinking about something, suddenly this occurred to me. I was thinking, what do I want PayPal to be? I've got this really great privileged job where I have the ability to serve close to 5,000, 6,000 people, right? And so what do I want my contribution to be? I said, I would love to see if PayPal can be a happy place where people can truly be themselves, where they can bring their best selves to the table. They can do the work of their lives while at the same time having the time of their lives. What can they do to truly find that kind of fulfillment in their roles, right? Because all of us work for a salary, absolutely, yes. We work to make sure that our resumes are getting better and looking brighter and shinier, absolutely, yes. But are those the only two reasons we work? No, we work because we find community, we find acceptance, we find a sense of family in the places that we work in. And for us, so the ideal way, for any leader to behave would be to infuse as much trust from his or her vantage point, right? And I think for us, when I thought about it and thought, okay, PayPal should be a happy place. Now, what's the next step? Who are the best people who are equipped to make this? It's not me. It's not the leadership team with fancy titles. It's actually everybody, including me, right? It's not. It doesn't exclude me, but it certainly doesn't begin and end with me. The best people are everybody. Everybody should have a role in making it a happy place. Only then will it be a truly happy place. So, and guess what? If you add happy and place together, there's PYPL right in the middle. That's our stock ticker symbol. And I said, wow, this is too good to be true. So I called up a friend of mine who happened to be in PayPal in Chennai at that time. He was leading our UX design team. And I said, Malcolm, you need to help me with this. And you need to get me a logo that is worthy of a beautiful concatenation of words like this that magically has our ticker symbol in the middle, right? So we started the program. It had a beautiful logo thanks to Malcolm and a guy called Avis on his team who built it. And then we built a program around this. The concept is very simple. Our employees are the best source of our ideas, the best source of our inspiration. We will hand over control to them to run everything related to our India centers. So the My Happy Place program was born, where everything that is to do with the center, what events we will run, how we will run those events, what we will focus on for the year, who will be involved, and how we will rotate talent through all of these different programs. Everything is decided by our employees. You could say, in a sense, that I am making my salary by outsourcing my job to the people in some sense. But the results have been stunning. We've got great sense of volunteerism in the organization. Lots of people feel they have skin in the game and they have a way to influence. New initiatives like a book club, like a music club, etc., have been born because of people coming in with these ideas and telling us. And it's been a humbling experience also, because some of the ideas are so good that in 1,000 years, I wouldn't have been able to dream them up. Yeah. And our employees are able to get them within a matter of minutes and seconds because of the deep involvement that they have, and because they're experiencing these problems on the ground every day. And so their understanding is that much deeper and more nuanced than mine can ever be. So this has been a huge addition to our culture. And thanks to having a nice logo and a brand name, certainly helps, because it's catchy. So people have a sense of curiosity when something is branded well. They're like, hey, what is that? What is that logo? It looks really good. How can I participate? And more people come in. So we have very happily exported the whole concept to our centers in Ireland, to our centers in Philippines, our centers in China. They are all operating in the same model now, thanks to the experiment that worked out beautifully in our favor in India.
And thanks to, I guess, the traffic jam in Bangalore at that point of time.
That's right. It's an underappreciated source of creative energy. It's just that people curse it. They should be celebrating it.
Yeah, and I feel some of those curses come from anyone who's been in Bangalore. I call that's another before times. I was in Bangalore for 7-8 years in school and college, and at that time it never took this long to go anywhere. I haven't obviously been there in a while. You also brought up an interesting point about, you said that it's like you handing over what would inherently be something that you would do, and through our chat you brought up a few points. So I'm intrigued to know, how do you look at leadership? Because I find that if you're in an organization for a longer period of time, you have been at PayPal for a period of time, as you grow through the system, how do you develop leadership as something that you do, and for you innately, what does leadership kind of mean? How do you look at that aspect?
So the first thing is, I think the word leadership is used with such a sense of gravitas all the time by people that there's a great perception of it being inaccessible to many. Yeah. And that it is somehow something that you graduate into in your life, that you have to acquire experience and maybe a few degrees and have the right breaks in your life to be able to achieve. Actually, that none of that is true. There is great leadership that is what is the right word? I'm struggling for the right word. It is exercised from every corner of the organization. In our daily lives, we will see great leadership examples that have nothing to do with title or privilege or power or anything like that. Leadership is essentially an attitude. It's not a position or title that you achieve. So somebody who joins the organization as a recent college grad yesterday will have as much ability to exert a leadership influence on the company as somebody who is the CEO of the company. It's just that many people don't believe that they have that ability, right? And they think that it's something that they have to look at others and learn at some point. Yes, we should definitely look at others and learn constantly, but we should never shortchange ourselves in our own ability to be leaders. So the idea is that every single person in the company can be a leader. It's just that you have to find the context in which you can exercise that leadership. And those contexts are numerous. In all of our jobs, I think there are decisions that you have to make. Every day, you have to decide on whether to do X or Y.
Yeah.
And many of us struggle with various influences that guide us in doing X or Y. If I do X, I might get promoted. If I do Y, somebody else might get the credit. These are the kinds of discussions that go on in our head. And those are totally the wrong discussions, right? The point of working is not to get promoted. The point of working is not to get credit for the work that you do. The credit you're already getting in the form of a salary and a paycheck that lands in your bank account every month. That's the credit should not be the end result of what you do it for. What you do it for should be for the mission that your company exists to serve. Are you serving the customer? Yeah, it's very simple. I've got 3 C's on which pretty much every decision inside a company context can be solved, right? Can be taken. One, is this the right decision for the customer? Is this the right decision for the company? Is this the right decision for your colleagues? Those are the 3 C's. As long as all of you are operating on the 4th C, which is context, which is the same context, then you should all be able to align on a decision that works for the company, for your colleagues, for your customers, and you should be able to always stand behind it because it's the right decision. And that's leadership to me. Leadership is about making those choices on the right dimensions and always within your context. It could be something as simple as what time should the transport system for the company run every day. You can always find a way to solve all of these and make the right decisions if you keep these things in mind. And you don't need to have a high flying title to do that. You can do it by being the driver of a car as well, right?
Yeah.
You have a meaningful, important job in the company. Every single person does. So for me, leadership is about getting people to believe that, right? They have to believe that they have power, that they don't see, but it's there in their hands, and that they should be able to exercise it. Now, what creates certain conditions in a company for people to be able to do this? Accessibility. Even people in very high positions of power within the company should be able to access other people easily. You should be able to reach out to, for a favorite example of mine is how engineers on the ground will constantly ping our CTO, Sri Shivananda, with ideas. And he always has time for them. He will immediately respond back to them. He will remember their names. He'll remember the idea that they had suggested 3 years ago and ask about what happened to that and if they made progress. So that means a lot to an engineer. Talking to the CTO of a company is a very big deal. And for that CTO to remember what you talked to them about 3 years ago is an even bigger deal, right? That shows that you are so valuable in the company. And we are lucky that right from our CEO, Dan Schulman, to various leaders in the company, this is one attribute that I truly enjoy. All leaders are extremely accessible. For a company with close to 50,000 people, we are a very flat company in that sense. Anybody can reach out to anybody else with ideas, with suggestions. It is welcomed, it is celebrated, it is the barriers and the boundaries are very low. That creates a highly trustful culture. And let's fail fast, make some mistakes, that's fine, but let's keep innovating kind of a culture. And that's important.
One of the points you just made, and I found that, and I start thinking about I put a point about how we work right now versus how we used to work. Right, before times you'd all go to an office space, you do that, and many times if you are in the same geography or in the same office, proximity to someone who you would report into or a team member, etc., would mean that those things you had in mind about the promotion or about getting the credit for it, etc. Do you kind of feel that the move to being a lot more remote, the move to functioning the way we are, has made that aspect become a lot simpler to look at? Because you are in a sense wherever you might sit, your accessibility is exactly the same as everybody else. Plus, your ability to show that this is stuff that you actually made in most cases, and I can't generalize on this front, also becomes a far simpler thing. So that's on one end, but how has the culture aspect as well seeped in, when, especially with this way of functioning? I think that there are two legs to this one, but I'd love to get your point.
So I'll preface the response by admitting, my own bias, right? I am not at all a fan of remote working, and I cannot wait to get back to the office. I thrive on in-person interactions. But having said that, in spite of being a diehard proponent of in-office work, I have to admit that a few myths have been broken because of the way that we are working in right now in terms of remote working. Earlier, there was quite a heavy emphasis placed on face-to-face interactions, hallway conversations, the secret sauce of being able to go to the water cooler and absorb a lot of organizational knowledge that will help you progress in your projects or in your career, etc. Right? So there was a lot of importance given to that, and justifiably so, because a lot of things used to happen in those casual conversations before. The fact that we are all able to run just fine as companies so far, shows you that you can do it without those hallway conversations, that you can all, be democratic about access to that kind of information, and you can still function. The long-term impacts are, of course, yet to be determined, but at least in the short term, we're all functioning just fine, which means that, all roles, given that everybody is remote, regardless of where they're in the world, have an equal footing and a level playing field now in the new world. And that is really good. Of course, you still miss the other aspects of human connection, of being able to empathize, look people in the eye, not in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions, all of that, right? But definitely access to information, flat hierarchy, the flatness of the earth, so to speak, is all something that has played out as a result of this pandemic. And even in certain roles, right, there were certain myths around product management roles from India are inherently harder because you don't have access to the market. You don't have access to customers. Well, guess what? Product managers anywhere don't have access to customers right now. Everybody is remote. Yeah. So whatever insight you have to glean from in-person interaction with your customers, everybody now has the disadvantage or the advantage, depending on which way you look at it, of doing it remotely and virtually. So you have no particular advantage that you derive from being 5 miles away from the customer versus 5,000 miles away. And as a result of that, you find that the products are still getting built beautifully. The customers are still being made happy, which means that these roles can be played from other parts of the world as well. That there was a myth around it being requiring physical proximity, which is probably not true. So there are a lot of myths that have gotten busted as a result of the pandemic, and that's good. I think we'll all evolve our working models to be far more efficient and find talent anywhere in the world, as long as it's the right talent for the job.
This is a question I actually ask a lot of my guests, and is that when you started off your career, is this what you wanted to do? Are you doing what you set out to do, and if not, what was it that you set out to do in the first place?
Not at all. So I did my bachelor's in computer science. I did my master's in computer science as well. I was out and out an individual contributor, very, very heavily in love with programming, operating systems in particular. I used to work for Sun Microsystems, one of the most wonderful companies on the planet ever. And doing that work was what fulfilled me. And I with due apologies to any of my previous managers who might be listening to this call, especially from my days as an individual contributor, I used to have a disdain for management, as in not disdain as in for the individuals, but for the job of being a manager. Yeah. It was a headache that I couldn't ever consider taking on. I'm like, who the hell would want to do this? Why wouldn't somebody want to just keep coding and learning new things in technology and bringing new architectures to life and all of that? Why would somebody want to performance manage another individual, figure all these PowerPoint spread and all these spreadsheets and slide decks? Yeah. Why on earth would somebody ever want to do any of that? That was my myopic vision of what the job was, naturally. But no way did I ever, when I was starting off my career, think that I would be doing what I'm doing today. Absolutely not.
As we come towards the end of every episode, I ask my guests a set of questions. These questions have pretty much stayed the same for episodes and episodes, but I still continue to ask the same questions because I feel that the answers always are intriguing.
Sure.
What do you, for people who might know you professionally, um, what do you spend a lot of time doing beyond work and beyond what they would know that they'd be surprised? Say, wait, you spend a lot of time doing this. It could be something you watch, it could be something that you do, can be anything. It's just one of those things like, really, you're into that? What would that be?
I would say that these days, with the business being what it is, my attention is hugely devoted to work and probably disproportionately so. But the passions that truly drive me outside of work, one is tennis. I'm an avid tennis fanatic. Anybody who knows me already knows this, because I can't stop talking about tennis, and in particular about Roger Federer and the beautiful game he plays. And then, I also analyze tennis games. I write about tennis games. Even when I bring in elements of writing about leadership on my blog, I still find a way to connect it to tennis again. So tennis is a huge obsession of mine. I love reading. I am a trivia buff. I love just knowing random things about random things. I mean, I just love picking up random trivial bits of information. So I often joke that when I'm in a checkout line in a supermarket, when in the before times when we used to go and do these kinds of rash and very dangerous things, like standing in checkout lines with other people around us. There are some places where there are magazine racks that are placed, with magazines on them, and I'd always be reading. It doesn't matter whether it is some useful information for me or not personally, but I'm still driven to pick up that information. For example, it intrigues me that there are 107 different ways to apply mascara as it reads on the Cosmopolitan cover. And immediately I would like, wow, what are these 107 ways? That's interesting. So, I'm an inveterate reader. So I love picking up and reading random bits of trivia, whatever I can lay my hands on.
So the term I use for that is actually call it useless information, and why I call it useless information is because there is stuff you learn for your career, and that's supposed to be useful. It's this useless stuff that actually builds your character, because it really truly shows your innate. It's the childiness that continues to still be there and loves to know random fact. I actually did not know there were so many. I'm going to dig into this one as well. You give me something to kind of read about today. What have you read in the recent past that you would recommend?
It's a beautiful, there is reading that I do that is completely unconnected with work. And then there's reading that I do that is somewhere on the periphery of leadership, self-help, self-improvement, etc. And I keep telling all the folks that I work with, don't index too heavily only on the self-improvement thing. So when you're in the middle of your career, right, when things are going well, there's this innate tendency, how can I improve? How can I make progress? What can I read? And, self-help and the 7 different strategies to do X, Y, or Z and whatnot, right? And it makes you a unidimensional person. So don't fall into that trap. You always keep your reading very diverse, because that gives you other perspective that you should have. And sometimes you should read for the joy of reading. And for me, one book that I took up recently again for the, I don't know, at last count, maybe the 187th time, would be the Asterix series of comics. I'm a huge fan of Asterix and Obelix, so I can read those comics over and over and again and again, and still find something that I have missed during my previous times and laugh about it and find it interesting. The other author that I truly enjoy is P.G. Wodehouse. I'm a huge fan of P.G. Wodehouse. Like tennis, P.G. Wodehouse is also an obsession of mine. I've practically read every book that P.G. Wodehouse has written. I've read about 92 books, and I think he has written 107. The numbers differ based on differing counts, but I have not read all, but I've read nearly all. So I read the first book that I'd ever read of P.G. Wodehouse was this book called Uncle Fred in the Springtime. And I picked that book up again and read it. I had a great time. What's on my bedside reading right now is the graphic novel version of Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, great book. that I had read already, and there's a delightful graphic novel version of that. And so that's what I've been spending time falling asleep to in the last few days.
You actually had me at Asterix because one of my pet peeves was trying to figure out. I love the names, so be it cacophonics or geriatrics or all of a sudden it innately tells you what those people do or what they are like. So that's been one of those things I kind of go back to trying to figure out the names and what they actually do and stuff. So yeah, an old favorite as well, and something which I'm kind of waiting for my now almost 4-year-old to kind of discover at some point soon. Waiting for that point to come. My general last question, and I thought about what this question would be. I normally ask my guests why something won't die, because the show's called Advertising is Dead, and my point always has been that you always say this thing is dead and gone. And why do you think digital money will not die? Or should I say money will not die? I'm going to give you the option between the two, because I want to kind of get your take on it, especially going back to how you started off with the barter systems. I'd love to hear your take on that.
No, I don't think I've ever been asked this question, Varun. So you and your readers know that listeners know that this is completely unscripted and off the cuff, and possibly something that I will go back, 2 days from now and say, man, why didn't I say X or Y or Z, and why did I say this, right? But I think that no matter what happens, money, the concept of money, whether it's digital today and tomorrow, it might be some other form that we haven't even dreamt of today. Why it won't die, I think, has more to do with the human condition and human attitudes towards what constitutes life, right? Personal ambition, personal desire, the aspect of humans coveting something that other people have or don't have, those are not going to die. No matter how much technology pervades our lives, no matter how much equity and inclusion pervades human existence, which I hope it does, the aspect of wanting to be unique, wanting to have something that somebody else doesn't have, wanting to acquire, wanting to build, wanting to create, will never go away. And as long as humans have these urges to not just lie in one place and exist, but to constantly exist and create more, the money will be the medium through which they will acquire the tools and the skills and the objects that they need to keep creating. And as long as humans have that urge within them, money is something that they cannot get away from.
I don't think you'll have to rethink that answer at all. I think that it's an insightful answer to what is generally a very corny way to finish off every episode, which I do. Thanks a ton, Guru. Thanks for doing this, and it's been a fabulous conversation. And most times when an episode crosses a little over an hour when we're recording it, I always say that because this has been we've taken it to multiple directions, it's still been engaging. And thank you so much for coming on Advertising is Dead.
Thank you, Varun. You make a wonderful host, and thank you so much to your entire team behind the scenes who do a lot of the work, I'm sure, in making this possible and bringing it to life. I'm hugely appreciative, and beyond everything else, I want all of you to stay extremely safe and sound during these very, very dark times. It'll all get over soon, and the sun will come shining through. I can guarantee it. But until then, we all have to double mask, be super safe, wash our hands, not go out unless it's really, really needed, and just keep ourselves and our loved ones safe.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the after times.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Varun.